want to quickly introduce our panel of speakers who are from different backgrounds, from different parts of the world. And I'm not going to say the last name. So James from Mount Royal University, and then we have Jane from Blackish Institute of Technology, and we have Jonah from Tangaza University, as well as Paulo from the University of Oxford. So today what we are going to do is to look at the practices of teaching social entrepreneurship education, but we are looking at a much more specific focus is how far are we arriving at the tipping point of social entrepreneurship education in terms of different stakeholders thinking, and we are seeing that social entrepreneurship education is going to be a mainstream focus to some extent compared to other programs. So obviously we have James, who is the director of the Institute for Social Transformation and sorry, I messed it up. It should be, we have Jane who is PhDs in Education for Sustainability Leadership and focuses on how to best design learning experiences to support change agents for system transformation. And the fun fact about Jane is that she is thrilled that she has officially defended her dissertation last week for her PhD. Yeah, congratulations, Jane. And then Jonas he's the director of the Institute for Social Transformation at Tangaza University College. He's a critical educator and a social entrepreneur. And Jonas just launched the Africa Academic Hub at the annual Social Entrepreneurship Conference in Nairobi in May, and with 450 social entrepreneurs attending. So congratulations, Jonas. And then we have another quick introduction of Paulo, an associate professor at the University of Oxford, and he is working across Engineering Science Department and Said Business School. And the fun fact about Paulo is that he just published 4 workarounds, a book, Strategies from the World's Scrappiest Organizations for Tackling Complex Problems. So unfortunately, I'm trying to quickly scan through Jane's details, which he's the executive director of the Institute for Community Prosperity at Mount Royal University, where he has developed and co-created social innovation, leadership, and system-focused learning programs for both undergraduates and also a broader community. And I'll leave it to you, James, for the fun fact that you are going to share with us later, since you are going to be the first speaker. So as I've said very quickly, for those who have just joined today, we're going to ground our discussion into a focus. Next, please, Jonah, and which is to look at the tipping point for systems change in education for tackling complex problems, or some scholars talked about it as grand challenges. And today, we're going to have 2 sessions. One, we will have the speakers to speak first, and then we'll go into breakout rooms where all of you could chat more, and also more importantly, is to give us ideas for the second question. What can we do to quicken the arrival of the tipping point or the convergence of enabling factors? To further elaborate, next please, Fiona, is to further elaborate on what I'm talking about is some definitions, looking at what is a system and what is meant by system change. And tipping point is talking about a series of small changes or incidents that become significant enough to cause a larger important change. And social entrepreneurship education, we broadly are talking about development of competencies and skills. Next, please, Shannon. And before we have the speakers taking us through some of the near tipping point or not so near stages in where they are and where they work, I just want to quickly take you through a model talking about systems change. There's obviously, there's a source citation there, but it's obviously taken from change management, talking about the different stages. And I will show where the tipping point means within this model of systemic change. We're talking about how as a status quo, we have the old systems operating, but when we are now talking about systems change, creating impact, then we are drawing awareness that we need to do things differently. And we together will explore and we'll enter a transition, and hopefully new structure will emerge. And now, whether you agree or not, you could disagree later on and talk about it in the breakout rooms about the emergence of the tipping point. And then eventually we'll have a new system. So in order to clarify our focus of discussion, that's what we meant by a tipping point. Okay, so these are two slides that I put in extra, but we could kind of skip that and quickly bring in James, who are going to speak more excitingly about what he does and the wonderful work he is steering. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Susanna, for that great introduction, and a great introduction to the topic as well. So I'm speaking to you today from the Treaty 7 portion of the Tsiksikai-Chitapi, which is the Blackfoot Nation. Traditional territory stretches east from the Rocky Mountains, from roughly Edmonton or the North Saskatchewan River, all the way down to southern Montana, in what is present-day Yellowstone Park. And Treaty 7 is also home to Dene, Sioux, Métis peoples. The modern name for this place is Calgary, Canada. And the Institute for Community Prosperity, we're based at Mount Royal University, which is a public liberal arts undergrad institution. It's a place where we try and undertake powerful co-curricular programming for students, undergrad students, in the service of positive social community change. So we engage in lots of different kinds of partnerships with community around social R&D, system scale understanding of social phenomena, and exploring socially innovative ways to achieve impact. So in terms of whether we have reached a systems change education tipping point, I would say, first of all, I'm going to handle that in 3 different ways. First of all, academia, no, not yet. I still think we're living with both the positive and the negative sides of the legacy of the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution in academia, which has, of course, helped save countless lives. It's reduced suffering. It's helped us understand the cosmos, all sorts of good things, feed more people. But it has also bequeathed a lot of baggage, reductionism, unhelpful disciplinary boundaries, an education system that incentivizes and rewards specialization. There are very few system scholars out there, right? Most people narrow in as they go up the academic ladder, and we desperately need system scholars. We're similarly ill-equipped in public schools, which are rooted in the kind of industrial learning system that values answers over questions. So, the system is you memorize answers, especially those that are going to be on the exam, you study accordingly, and your brain is subtly trained not to ask questions over time, not to be curious, and to be embarrassed by the naive questions, which frankly, I think are the kinds of questions we most need these days. There's some promising developments in education around, in this part of the world, decolonization, indigenization of learning institutions, the increasing role and prominence of Indigenous leadership, bringing a worldview that is more holistic, more relational. Everything is connected to everything. So in many ways, systems thinking is a natural way of viewing the world that we're rediscovering. I would say with respect to funders, not quite at a tipping point either. It's kind of remarkable because I think philanthropic funders especially are really uniquely positioned to take the long view and have both a futures orientation and a wider scope on the community or the issue they're investing in. So, I've heard some funders already express fatigue with systems thinking. or dismissing it as a fad. But in my view, I think we're just barely getting started. So I actually think where we might be closer to a tipping point is with respect to kind of everywhere else, the broader suite of practitioners working on complex challenges. So here I think we see people in all sectors starting to become interested in systems thinking. One of the reasons is, it's becoming obvious that the current way of doing things is inadequate. So like many other places on Earth, we in Canada are seeing the global perma-crisis play itself out. The 2023 wildfires have burned an area of forest the size of Uruguay, or 4 times the size of Denmark. The boreal forest, once regarded as a carbon sink, is now increasingly a carbon tap. So it's rife with sort of nonlinear dynamics, right? The release of methane stored in permafrost, black carbon on glaciers and sea ice. And then this alongside an unprecedented affordable housing crisis, a healthcare crisis, a drug poisoning crisis, a youth mental health crisis, massive political polarization. The list keeps growing. And I, in the commercial sector, even I'd say people who are working on serious commercial innovation, they understand, and to paraphrase the quote often attributed to Einstein, if you have an hour to solve a problem, you spend the first 55 minutes thinking about the problem and the last 5 minutes on the solution. So right now we have an innovation ecosystem marked by startup culture, pitch competitions, design sprints, hackathons, and on, focused on the last 5 minutes. And then the 55 minutes before that are really, at the back end, it's flipped, devoted to rationalizing the chosen solutions. So I think smart innovation shops are starting to flip that again and realize, yeah, we need to focus on the problem. And so that's where we're shifting much of our energy. We run Map the System in Canada, which is a partnership with the Skoll Center at the University of Oxford, where students in Canada, about 15 to 20 schools, use systems learning tools to understand, map, communicate a complex social or environmental challenge. And we actually in 2019 developed a resource to help students undertake this challenge alongside Daniela Pappy-Thornton, who was the founder of the challenge when she was at the Skoll Center. But to our surprise, we started hearing from policymakers, from people in government, and practitioners in the nonprofit sector, in the commercial sector, well beyond the academic setting, saying, we actually use the guide, we just redact the parts that refer to students. But what do you think of creating a guide that's kind of for everybody else? And so we are in the very beta stage with this new guide. We have a lot of writing ahead of us. But I did want to share this with you. This is an early, and again, very beta model framework for how we're constructing the guide. We actually were drawn to this camera metaphor. It's a system lens helps us kind of capture the zooming in and the zooming out, the filtering, etc. We're abandoning this diagram. If you go to the next slide, essentially each segment of this camera represents a chapter in our initial version of this. There's a whole section on foundations for systems thinking, and then there's a section at the end that's all about bridges to action. But what we're really focusing on are the tools for systems learning. And we're trying to develop it in a way that it's non-linear, because you can kind of start anywhere and you're constantly revisiting the question, the nature of the problem, the nature of the system you're actually exploring. You might start with one sense of what the problem is and what the system is that you're bounding and looking at. But as you start to dive into each tool, a slightly different system or a slightly different framing of the problem is revealed. And I think it was Odin Mullenbein who says, 50% of your work in systems thinking is actually defining the problem. That's incredibly true. This is just a slight teaser, so I can't get into the details. I'd be happy to in the Q&A if there's time, but that's essentially where we're at. Yeah, back to you, Sue.
Wow, thank you, James. It's a really wonderful guide. I will talk to you because I'm going to start a new module on sustainable entrepreneurship. That is what I'm going to explore by teaching systems thinking. Thank you, James, for the insightful information as well as what you're doing. Next is going to be Jane, who is going to talk about the inner work on systems change. Over to you, Jane.
Thanks, Sue. And thanks, James. That's lovely. I really like that you framed the problem for me. So you'll hear in the next 7 minutes or so, I will talk about sustainability and competencies that we need in order to lead for sustainability change. Within that, systems thinking is a key element. So for me, when I talk about sustainability, in order to understand sustainability, systems thinking is absolutely essential. So I'll talk a little bit more about that and how I frame that in a minute. And leadership, for me, is the aspect that says it's the human beings within the system that are going to be leading the change, not by ourselves, together in collaboration. So I'm just trying to frame a little bit of that. And you can see on this slide here, Education for Sustainability Leadership. As Sue already said, I've only just defended my PhD, which is pretty exciting. And this was the title, Supporting and Empowering Agents for Sustainability Transformations. If we could go to the next one. Now, I did on that slide, you'll see in the chat, there'll be a link. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that work, about my broader work, please click on the link. There's also a whole lot of links to the different papers that compose that thesis. One of them is what I'm going to talk about a little bit more now, and it talks about the inner work of sustainability leadership. So I'm going to back up a bit. Key competencies in sustainability. What I'm interested in looking at, as Sue said earlier, is what is it? Who is it? How is it that we need to be to lead change towards sustainability? And how do we develop that within human beings? What's the education component of that? And this literature is in my field. It's quite a lot. So we're talking about if we want to graduate people capable of making this change for sustainability. And James, you did a beautiful summary of sustainability, you know, like the environmental concerns, we've got the social concerns of that. How do we do that? So it's not just basic academic competencies that we hope our graduates have, like, you know, reading, communication skills, critical thinking, absolutely. But we hope that all university graduates have that. Then there's going to be topical knowledge, you know, the disciplines that James just referred to. Of course, we do need to have specialists in chemistry. We need specialists in all these different fields. But what is it that makes sustainability education unique? And that's where we come to this particular model, which says that there are these 8 different competencies that are unique for a sustainability graduate. So systems thinking competence is one of those. What I think is really interesting in that is that there's also this values thinking competence, you know? So it is a values position to say, I want to move towards a more equal, fair, just society. That is a values statement. And without that, I mean, you're not going to be working towards something more sustainable. We can have transformations of systems, but they're not necessarily moving towards something that's going to be more sustainable. You can have, could you go back, please? I just want to speak to that a little bit more. So there's futures thinking competence, the ability to anticipate what might happen in the future. All of these different things are what we need to develop in human beings in order to lead the change for a more sustainable world. What has been missing in a lot of these conversations is the inner aspect or the inner work. So some of you may be familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals. I hope all of you are probably familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals, but some of you might also be aware of the Inner Development Goals, which is some new work that's been happening in Sweden quite a lot. And that's looking at who do we need to be as human beings in a society to move towards these sustainable development goals. So it's with that kind of thinking. This next, if you could go to the next slide now, this next slide is kind of our response to that question of what's the inner work? What are the things that we need to develop in order to lead the change? And this is a very brief summary of some of the capacities that we believe we need to develop. For example, the ability to hold complexity, the ability to foster a learner's mindset, to deeply value others, to let be, to show up as one's full self, to regulate and manage the self, to persist with lightness in all the darkness that can surround, and to ensure one's well-being. There are some links that we're putting in the chat to both the academic paper, and I also believe just a little video that summarizes that, if any of you are interested in talking more about that. This is my last plug. So a lot of my research was done within and through this particular master's program. So I'm a graduate of this program 15 years ago. I moved back to Sweden from Wajak Noongar Budja, which is where I'm from, also known as Perth, Western Australia, in order to study this master's program, a master's in strategic leadership towards sustainability. I came back and I did my PhD. I've been co-director of this program. I've been teaching on this program for the last 5.5 years. If you're interested in a pretty amazing systems education program, I do recommend that you check this out. And there should be a link to that also. And that's me for now. Please ask me any questions in later.
Thank you, Jane. A good direction for those who want to pursue further education is really good. And so I'm going to pass it on to Jonas, who will take us through more solid work in terms of social transformation in education that he is working on, and how at where he is going to show us the concrete network as well that he has been building. Over to you, Jonas.
Okay, thanks a lot too. I work here at Tangaza University College, which is a private university here in Nairobi, Kenya. And specifically, I'm the director of the Institute for Social Transformation. As you can see, the name already tells that the work that we do is on social transformation. And what we understand by that in education particularly is basically designing an education system that gives tools and capabilities to students to be transformers in the society. Our strong belief is that education is key to social transformation. If you want to transform society, you want to transform community, the starting point is education. And we look at education in a broader way, not education within the university. But now, when it comes to education in the context of academic education, education for social transformation differ from what we see. What we see currently is education, or the dominant education model that we have is education that is designed to produce what I call executors, people who just get to execute things. So that is not education for social transformation. So we want education, this kind of education certainly fails society, because when you produce people who only execute, then you fail society. You are not producing people who are creators, people who are innovators, people who are able to solve problems. And you fail society, not only society, but you also fail students, because at the end, they are not able to fit in the society, they are not able to contribute to society. So for us, education for social transformation require redesigning what we have currently. I think that's the type of work that we are trying to do at the Institute of Social Transformation, rethinking how we teach, rethinking how we train students. Okay? So I want just to highlight 4 points of what it means for us, education for social transformation. The first point is changing the space, the classroom space. Okay? The classroom space is a very important space for learning, but education for social transformation cannot be confined to classroom. Okay? It's just of one of the spaces for learning, for transformation. That's why I think that we need to expand the learning space. And I talk about merging spaces, learning spaces, basically bringing other spaces, community, homes, and all that, merging that, because learning happens in all those spaces. Okay? So for me, it's a very important point to shift from thinking that classroom is the only space for learning. I think that's the model that we have now. So this kind of restricts the learner. But if we are able to merge what happened in the classroom with the community, in the society, in the homes, in the churches, then we expand the learning space for the learner. That is the first point, be able kind of change the learning space. Okay? That's why for us, we put a lot of emphasis on moving students from classroom to community, from community to classrooms, okay? Or from society to classroom. If you disconnect the two, then we are doing disservice to the student. The second point in this model for of education for social transformation is what I call creative knowledge. We tend to pump students with information. I think we are in an age where knowledge is everywhere. Sometimes students are even better off, knowing some of the things that we teach them. But how do you provide knowledge that triggers thinking and change in the student? I think for me, that is very important on what is given to students in the classroom space. Not only information from books and from other, but how do you translate that information in something that transforms the person, challenges the person? Okay, I think that's for me a very important pillar of education for transformation, a knowledge that actually transforms the person. The third element is what I call educator positionality. We need to realize that educators influence what happened to the learners. Okay, here in the positionality, I talk about the identity, the power dynamics, and the perception of the educator of what is his or her job in the learning space. If we are not deeply aware of that, that affects the relationship with the student, because educator can be oppressive in the learning space without realizing it. Okay? And you can also terrorize students. Okay? So you can be in the space, in the learning space, educators can be a trigger for change, or it can also be an impediment for change. So we need to understand our positionality in the learning space. And for me, I think it becomes very important that we challenge ourselves as educators and rethink what is our role in the education space. What are we doing? Which I believe is basically to trigger change in the learner. The fourth pillar of this model is what I call student agency. For me, that's the essence of education. Education should be able to equip students to be able to act. Okay. So what happened when students go through education for 4 years or 5 years and it's not able to use even that skills in the society? So it means that the education has not enabled students to be an agent of change in this community, in the workplace and all that. So agency should be a key driver of education that we offer. One of the things I've noticed why we are educators afraid of developing this agency in the student, because they feel also they will be challenged. Sometimes they feel they will be challenged, especially in the context in which I'm speaking, in African context. Education, because when you develop that in the student are able to challenge everything. What you say, what you do in the learning space. So, but we should be open to that, to develop that, because when somebody talked about questioning, for instance, when you enable students to question everything around them, even in the classroom, then these students are able to question you. But if they're able to do that, then you know that your students are learning. I normally say one thing is that when my students start asking some kind of question, making connection about things, then I'm so happy. I think now my students are learning. They are not only sponge absorbing, but they are people who are really thinking. They are learning. So I think those are the 4 pillars of what I call education for social transformation. That is what we are trying to do, and there is a lot of work that needs to be done with educators. Okay, in this space. So are we reaching the tipping point? I think for me, yeah, we are still at the early stage. We can see something moving, but we are not yet there. There is a lot of work that needs to do. That's why I think this kind of conversation gives us an opportunity also to learn from each other, to learn from the different models that are emerging some of the positive experiences that educators are having or developing. Okay, so I think for me, I want to say that we need education for social transformation require merging learning spaces. It requires rethinking the positionalities of the educators, and also it requires shifting what the model of the dominant model of education that we have had up to now, and then we'll be seeing some changes, some tipping point taking place. I think let me leave it there.
Wow. Thank you, Jonas. It's really wonderful to have you put us into a very graphical picture of what could we do in education, using it as an enabler for social transformation. And that's very useful. But at the same time, we have to deal with the reality that we are not there yet. So what else, what more could we do? So we have talked about systems thinking as a tool, and then Jane pointed us at the competencies that we need to nurture our students with as sustainable leaders, and then how education in general would bring about social transformation. I think there is one element that is really important, which is the collective action, collective capacity that Paulo will inspire us with his delivery. So over to you, Paulo.
Thank you, Susanna, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm very happy to be here and to learn from others, and also to share a little bit of my experiences working on systems change. The first thing that I would like to highlight, I've worked at different places, but at the University of Oxford across many programs. So, for example, I lead the entrepreneurship module that emphasizes how a systems approach can transform entrepreneurial approaches more broadly, and also strategies for impact, trying to look at these different strategies that can learn from systems thinking as well. And many extracurricular activities like Map the System, GoTo, that is a flagship module for grand challenges in Oxford. And as I reflect, and I try to bring a twist here to some of these discussions, the reflecting across these various educational programs, I started asking myself how my research also influences the ways that I teach. And one of the observations that I came across when engaging with systems change is that students come to the classroom very skeptical of systems thinking, right? And this may not be a surprise to many of you here in the room, because they think that it's everything and nothing, that it's a fad. And to some extent, I think it conveys something important, right? Their frustration is not to prove them wrong, it's to understand what's happening there and why we are not engaging them with these systems discussions, because the many different systems is not a thing, right? And the many different ways of assessing a system and intervening in systems. And it's so powerful, but at the same time, because of its complexity, it might be a bit overwhelming for people to get a grasp of. And also, other challenge that I've seen across these programs is that very often when using a systems lens, people end up relying on similar sets of recommendations, right? So because the problems are so complex, you're using a system lens to appraise, for example, climate change, you're gonna recommend more collaboration, more coordination, more alignment, these things that are not wrong at all, but they are very generic, right? And then ultimately we start asking, like, why am I using the systems lens or approaches in the first place? So I see some frustrations related to that. And I'm gonna bring a little bit on like how through research, I try to contextualize different systems approaches to different situations, right? They are far from being applicable in every context or to provide single answers, but they enriched, I think, the way that I currently teach systems change. The first slide here that you were seeing, the previous slide, is a book that I published recently that is called The 4 Workarounds. And it started a bit from this frustration of always coming up with similar recommendations when approaching with a systems lens. And I started asking myself, okay, so if we want to make systems change here and now with the resources that are available to you, with immediate outcomes, how do people do that? And then I started working with computer hackers, actual computer hackers that break into complex computer systems to see how they hacked these systems, right? How do they do that? I didn't really understand much what they did with these complex systems. And then after learning from hackers, I understood how organizations, even though they don't describe themselves as hackers, but many organizations worldwide addressing problems in other systems, like healthcare systems, education systems, sanitation systems. There are many organizations out there addressing complex problems in very hacky ways, even though they don't describe themselves as hackers, right? So I started working with these kinds of organizations that I call scrappy, and identified various different ways in which these organizations are hacking all kinds of systems and getting results that are immediate and very resourceful as well, in ways that I would say that are very empowering, because we don't have to map a whole system. We don't have to understand the full complexity of the situation, but we still can find possibilities, entry points to intervene that can have outsized impacts later on. So I would say that it's an empowering way of looking at systems without necessarily requiring a lot of resources, coordination, and long time frames as well. So yeah, the next slide. One of the questions that we constantly ask ourselves when making interventions, and the ones here in this virtual room who have worked in the development space or with nonprofits, for example, a constant question is, how do you leave a self-sustaining legacy, right? We have a project funded for 5 years. Things may go amazingly well during these 5 years. How do we ensure that there's a legacy after the project is gone? And very often development agencies have been criticized for funding projects that after the project is gone, everything collapses, right? So they were not built for resilience. So how can we look at systems? And here I describe more from the perspective of ecosystems. How can we catalyze ecosystems in a way that the organization promoting the change, intervening in this ecosystem, can become redundant until it can withdraw from that ecosystem without compromising the functioning of that ecosystem? In other words, how can you make self-sustaining change without relying on a single organization to be part of that ecosystem? And that's very important, especially when you think of project management and development projects that have a specific time frame, and still they have to leave a legacy. So the next slide, I just want to show, and I don't expect you to read the whole table, but it's a study that we started looking at how different philanthropic organizations understand systems, because now many organizations say that their goal is to promote systems change. And then we were, okay, so what do they actually mean by that? And how do they translate these goals into intervention models? How do they operationalize that? And then our claim here is that there's no single best model for intervening in a system, and we actually need this plurality. We need a lot of organizations doing different things. It's not a single way forward that every organization should coalesce around this approach, right? We need the plurality of approaches, but they all have strengths and weaknesses. So we have to understand the strengths and weaknesses and find ways of developing these intervention models that are coherent, right? That if you want immediate results, perhaps you shouldn't be focused on intervention model B. You should be focused on intervention model A, right? So there are different ways of looking at these intervention models, and that are not necessarily saying that one is better than the other, but that we can make them more robust, these intervention models more robust, and that we can align them, these different models, these different approaches that have different strengths and weaknesses in a portfolio, so that we can amplify the overall impact of these philanthropic interventions. And just to wrap up, I want to show, in systems change, I think we have to shy away from just like zooming out, right? Zooming out, zooming in. We have to look at different models to act in systems and understand that we need plurality, we need variety, and that context really matters, right? And that system is not a single thing, the multiple possible systems, many different ways of looking at systems and intervening in them. And we need to convey that and mobilize students around this plurality. That's
Yeah, I can't agree with you more, Paolo. I think when we, all of you who have talked about systems and systems thinking, what I gather from Paolo probably is to look at the leverage point. Yes, systems could be, it's nice to know the bigger macro picture, but it's nice to zoom in. However, the most important thing is to find the leverage point so that you could actually make disruptive change out from that problematic system, which is ongoing, if I understood you correctly. And so at this particular point, I want to take 1 minute to thank all those who have come in. We still maintain a really good audience of group of 30 people. This is quite amazing. And at the same time, I want to thank those who have been helping us to keep the session going. You see a lot of chats and also the timekeeper. They are the good work of Shannon and Karen. So if we could at this particular point thank, other than Debbie, Karen and Shannon on the administration team. And I realized that I haven't introduced myself for keeping a good time management there. My bio's in the chat, but I've been with Catalyst for over 3 years as a member. And I myself is a researcher as well as a teacher of sustainability, social entrepreneurship, leadership. And so just a very brief bio of myself. Now, we go into the most exciting or another exciting session, which is you're going to go into different breakout rooms to chat with the different speakers. And so remember at the beginning where we want you to engage in further dialogue, and particularly coming out from the breakout session, we would like you to inspire us with a few actions that we could arrive at the tipping point. I think from all the speakers, we've gathered that we are still not there. So discuss more with your speakers, but at the same time, I hope that the speakers will bring back some of the interesting actions back into this main room here.
James from group 4 was
Yeah.
vigorously taking notes. So I'm sure he can give us a feedback from our group.
Sure.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I mean, we discussed a couple of really interesting divides that systems thinking is helping us to hopefully repair or narrow, and possibly with the assistance of AI too, which is really interesting. So the two divides are this the divide between the social and the economic, or the business world and the social world. That we have to recognize that generating wealth and generating social equity and environmental aims, that elusive sweet spot is something that we either work on one side or the other of that divide, but rarely in that middle. And then the other divide was just, there are divides between academic insight, the deep, rich, intellectual insight transferring to the community realm, and vice versa, the community insights, the practical insights transferring to academia. And we need much more permeability between those two spaces if we're going to get serious about systems thinking. And then leadership and mindset shift is the third theme we discussed a little bit. So really rich exchange of ideas and thoughts.
Thank you, James from breakout room 4 there. Am I right?
That's correct.
Thank you.
I believe so, yeah.
Really cool ideas. Which other guests would like to share with us your discussion points or actions?
I can go. Breakout room 1. I think we had very interesting conversation, knowing what others are doing in education and their thinking. Two things that have emerged in our conversation. The first is that we need to recognize that the current dominant model is not giving us the change we want to see. And so one way will be now trying to see how we infuse, that's the word, some informal learning into the formal learning. So that we'll be able to kind of enrich the formal learning. There is also the idea that came out about bringing into the formal learning indigenous learning knowledge. Okay, so I think that's one way that we can enrich education and see and bring about change. The second is connecting students. Different students from different backgrounds so that they are able to develop multiple perspectives of things so that they are not so narrow-minded. For instance, if you connect students from different geographical areas or different disciplines, they're able to broaden their perspective, their learning. Okay, so this approach, interdisciplinary approach, and then the idea of reflecting, helping more and more reflection should be part of education, because helping students to reflect on what they are learning and what is happening around them, vis-a-vis their learning. I think it will help it contribute to student growing and being transformed. So we will be able to transform education if we kind of use this approach of infusing reflection into learning. I think those are some of the key points emerging in our conversation.
Well, very, very, very useful, from pedagogies to how to make use of students' background to bring in multiple perspectives to actually create cross-disciplinary perspectives, and also bringing in the cognitive power or enhancing cognitive power. I think that aligns with the inner work that Jane talked about. So over to you, Jane, then. Thank you, Jonas.
Thank you.
We actually had a lovely conversation and got to know each other a little bit better, and then realized that we did have that question to ask and answer. And, nice jumping off, Jonas. We talked about transdisciplinarity being a key part. And in fact, the theme was kind of the same. Then we talked about engagement, with different people and across sectors, etc. And we talked about collaboration. So there's kind of, those generic same things that we need to do in terms of actions. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. And Paolo?
We had a very interesting discussion in our group as well. They shared some experiences they had, and the discussions were pretty much based on the different approaches that we had in these different contexts. But ultimately, what was common to everyone, including experiences in Bangladesh, in Kenya, and in Tunisia, was this drive for bringing more inclusion, engagement, more practicality as well, and ultimately like more engagement with broader audiences as well. So these were the common threads across these different programs and different initiatives we have been working on.
Right. I think how much more time? Thank you, Paolo. I'm really conscious of managing the time. How much more time do we have, Shannon?
We have another 5 minutes for question, answers, and discussion. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourselves or put it in the chat.
I have, could I have 1 minute? Because
yes,
interestingly, I was given a breakout room, whether that's deliberate or by mistake. So I've got Eviana from Bulgaria, Sylvie, and also Zipporah from Kenya. Sorry, Sylvia, I forgot where you're from. Where are you from?
From Canada.
Canada. Then we basically have a very distinct conclusion, is that we are all separated in different parts of the world, yet education in terms of social entrepreneurship, sustainability, they are not mainstream yet. And despite some places having a school of innovation, the resources allocated, they are only part-time and not really putting the right resources or sufficient there. So basically, in some parts of the world, resources or putting the related education as a mainstream learning for students, not quite there yet. So there's been talking about how to change the learning approach, the global learning, more inclusive, and also leadership, like what you have talked about. So quick report from my breakout room. So we're opening the floor for questions, question and answers.
I just ask, will the slides be shared with the recording to the participants?
Yes, it will be in a few days.
I have one just query. Can I ask you, please?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. Actually, I'm so fortunate to get the connection with this network, but is it possible to get some, or should I say, some connectivity so that we can get the Zoom link or registration link for the upcoming webinar? Is it possible from your side?
Yes, of course. We thought after the Q&A, we can share what we have today in the afternoon, another session, and we can do it towards the end, you will see it. Otherwise, on the Catalyst website, we have all our upcoming sessions.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions regarding today's session that someone might be interested in, or any reflections that they would like to share?
I just had one, if that's all right.
Of course.
Great. So just turning my camera on. So hello, everyone. Just to say that I had a lovely conversation in the breakout with Jonas, and I just wanted to say thanks for the presentations, which were all super interesting. I'm sort of working in this space in some ways, so you may see my name popping up in your LinkedIn going, hey, I would love to connect and have a conversation, because I think there's some follow-up to be done. But one question that I had just for all of you is that depending on your contexts, because I'm noticing, like, you know, the continents where you are and the spaces where you're working, do you think that the context where you are might be supporting inside of the university, even though universities are a little bit rigid in some cases, to shift or to be more open to seeing systems as being valuable or seeing alternative approaches to being valuable? I'm just kind of curious about, based on your different contexts, I'm wondering if your contexts are also enabling a certain kind of shift or change in the work. And so this was just a question that came to me.
I've got my view because I had my very precious experience over the last 12 years in Hong Kong in being part of the shifter and change makers. But I'll let the speakers first share your view as where you are, and then I'll share mine. Jonas, go ahead, far away.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. The context matters a lot. The context, you look at it from in terms of the university context and the national context or the regional context. Okay, they can enable the change in the education system, or they can literally block it. Okay, especially in the university. Let me just start from there, not expand. I think that most of the time we are part of a system. Most of the people in academia have been formed by a certain system. Unless they are able to make that effort to move out of the system, they become kind of a block and not a hindrance to a change in the or in education. So I think for me, that's what I see. Sometimes those who are supposed to make a decision, they themselves trapped into the system that has formed them. So we need a kind of liberation. People need to be liberated from the system that has formed them to be able to embrace a new system. I think I leave it there.
Yeah, I would echo what Jonas said. It's very context specific. I think certainly in our region where we're all kinds of institutions are having to confront the colonial reality of how we came to be as a nation. And, you know, a colonial institution, university academia is a colonial institution, but it contains paradoxes, right? So on the one hand, you know, indigenous people would say, well, you know, education is freedom, and we really value the liberatory possibilities of education, but we have to recognize that it's also a colonial institution and can easily bring a tremendous amount of baggage and locked, often ancient ways of doing things that aren't necessarily conducive to social innovation or changing systems. So it is very context specific, but it's also like academia is filled with these really interesting paradoxes that contain the seeds of its own destruction, I guess, or the seeds of its own new possibilities.
Just very quickly, Paula and Jay, if you have any to add, then we just have very little time left. Thank you. Just go on. Jay, is there anything you want to add?
Just, yes, very context specific. And I think what came up for me when you were saying that and listening in, it's like there's this values piece that we don't discuss, you know, even at a societal level. How does the society value the education, higher education? Is it funded? Is it free? Is it just for profit? Like where does the money flow and where does it come from? I think all of these things really influence, and I have the experience of Australia and Sweden to compare, but, and, you know, similar countries in many ways, but super different in terms of values and cost and all these kinds of things. That's my thought on that.
Paolo, last one?
I echo what everyone said. It's very context specific, but also we can learn from other contexts, right? And build on these, on analogous experiences and even on differences as well. So that's one of the values of a convening like this, that we can learn from so many different experiences and leave the session more inspired.
Great. So I've got 4 minutes, am I right, Shannon, to close the session? Just to respond to the question, context matters? Yes, context matters. But each one of us actually have a role to play if you choose to. I just want to give a 1-minute pitch. Over the last 12 years, I was really, really lucky. Although I'm now in the UK, I have been very active in Hong Kong. And what I saw was a $500,000 US dollar grant that actually triggered off a whole lot of activities, initiatives, and built an ecosystem. It was a government funding for a so-called social innovation and entrepreneurship fund. I was lucky enough to be part of that task force for that government over 6 years. So it's approving funding. But the leadership there was very important, that we decided to not just have a grant and get people to apply funding, but we want to actually create an ecosystem. So we built networks, we got consultation, we get the education, tertiary education people to come in and try to get money, but create programs, and we bring in all the social innovators together. So I was very lucky to be part of that. But at the same time, I chose to also start an NPO to promote social entrepreneurship. And I also spent time in doing social impact research. So I'm very, with hindsight, with 12 years, I think one thing I learned is we could do something to make things change. and Hong Kong is still have its own problem, but I think what I've seen, what is done, and it's really amazing. So we don't know how close we are to the tipping point, but we could do a lot more and more engaged. So I want to thank all of your attendance. Without all the lovely speakers, without all your presence, I don't think we have such a really fruitful session. And I love to have all those actions and put it into a list and see whether Debbie would share it, and then whether we could put it into some actions. And without dampening or making this momentum kind of trailing off, I want to introduce the next upcoming talk in the series. Shannon, do you have the posters to share so that everybody could have a look and have some idea?
Yes.
Lovely. So this is continuation of our discussion that Jane talked about, the inner work of systems change. So please note the time. Sorry, you're talking about today?
Yes, it's today afternoon.
Okay, in the afternoon. So if you haven't registered, please feel free to join. I know it's a bit busy, 2 sessions on the same day. But with this, I want to close the session. We're just on the dot, and whether it's the PowerPoint, whether it's the list of action to take, and all the materials that James, Jane, Jonas, and Paula share, we're going to share with all of you, and hope that we could continue our dialogue offline. And thank you so much for your attendance and all your guests inspiring sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you so
All the
much.
best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sharon, could you share?
Everyone.
Thank you.
Oh,
Bye-bye.
sorry, we have the poll. Sorry,
Yes.
Shona, you should have kind of nudged me. So for those who are still around, we've got 18 of us. Could you also complete the poll for us? Just take you 1 minute. Thank you. I believe that should the guests be filling that in as well?
Yes, yes. Whoever is there and would like to please fill it in. So we have
Yes,
some
please.
feedback to improve our sessions.
Thank you very much. So
Yes,
it's just
thank you.
Thank you.